Okay, good day and warm welcome to this thought-provoking event, Rethinking Harmony in Asia, Ensuring Safer and Ethical Digital World, organized by the Asia Network in partnership with ERIA and ADBC. This is the last session of this high-level conference, so glad that you could join us. With diverse experts, thought leaders, policymakers, technologists, and advocates, we will navigate the complex landscapes of the digital age in pursuit of a safer and more ethical world. I'm Kadra Saeed, your moderator, and I will shortly introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we'll start with introductory remarks from Cheryl Miller-Van Dÿck. Cheryl served as the head of EU delegation to the G20 Women 20 Engagement Group, chair and president of the Women Entrepreneurship Platform, and also advises European Commission projects in ethics in AI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the rural development initiatives. Unfortunately, Cheryl couldn't join us live. However, she is able to share her message through a recording she made earlier. We will now play that recording to kick off this event.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Miller. I'm the founder of the Brussels-based Digital Leadership Institute and co-head of the European Union delegation to Women 20, the official stakeholder engagement group to the G20 process. And I'd like to thank Navindra and the Asian Network team for inviting me to contribute to this important event, as well as ERIA and ADBC's, the organizations behind the conference, and this panel in particular on ensuring a safer and ethical digital world. I've had the opportunity to work on this question of digital equity and digital inclusion for over a decade, including at the G20 and UN and European Parliament. And I can say that still one of the most intransigent problems that we face in terms of creating a safe and ethical digital world is that half of the global population is clearly not on board in designing and building the digital society. And this problem is being compounded by the fact that the digitalization itself is growing by magnitudes, and then that we are running behind in terms of keeping ahead of the regulations and guidelines that are required to keep that environment safe and ethical. So for me, really two critical answers to that issue are, number one, that the safety of girls and women be on the critical path for building the digital society, but also that girls and women themselves become the designers and creators of that digital society. So fortunately, this year in the New Delhi Leaders Declaration of the G20, the leaders of the G20 nations committed to having the gender digital divide by 2030. And this, I think, is a critical first step in ensuring that there are programs in those largest economies of the world that are specifically targeting girls and women as beneficiaries to increase their participation in building the digital society. And I would say that that's a really critical success factor, is that the women themselves are target beneficiaries of development funding, that it not just be for closing the digital divide, but specifically for the gender digital divide, including as promoting women as deep tech starters, as IT experts, where, for example, in Europe, this number has flatlined over the past decade, and we only have, despite the digital disruption, 17% of IT experts in the workforce being women. And I'm sure these numbers translate to other parts of the world, also as tech entrepreneurs, that we have optimistic figures of 1 in 5 digital starters or tech starters are female, where I think in reality the number is closer to 1 in 10. So there are key policy challenges in terms of increasing participation of girls and women as builders of the digital society, and then also as the the communities most at risk of this increasing digitalization, and where we really need guidelines that don't address women and gender as a secondary issue, but really put those topics on the critical path of building the solutions and the guidelines that are going to deliver for us a more safe and ethical digital world. Because as we know, girls and women are disproportionately and negatively impacted in online environments, but also in terms of their human rights to having digital access are not ensured. So there are a lot of dimensions to this issue, but I think the most important is that when we discuss today what the answers to the challenges are, that we are sure to include the question of the girls and women and our most vulnerable societies, because indeed this is the only way that we will be able to have a safe and ethical digital world.
Okay, clear message from Cheryl around the inclusion of girls and women in designing and building a safe and ethical digital society. Now over to our panelists. They have been waiting patiently. Thank you all for joining. Meet Mrs.PeiChin. She is the digital government lead at the Tony Blair Institute in Singapore. Welcome, Pei-Chin. Allow me to introduce Siriwat Chhem, is a director of the Center for Inclusive Digital Economy at the Asian Vision Institute and advisor to the Council for Development of Cambodia. Welcome, Siriwat. Aakash Guglani, I hope I'm saying these names correctly, manager of Digital India Foundation. Aakash works on public policy, research, and decision-making. Welcome to you all once again. So now let's dive in. And maybe I'll start with you, Pei-Chin. And if you can start with you, can you share with us a good digital government practice and your key perspective on that area? Over to you, Pei-Chin.
Great, thank you. It's an honor to be here, to be sharing some of our findings with the audience. So maybe just to set the scene a little bit, across Asia, we've seen some really good and strong improvements over the years, and that has been evidenced by a number of indices from the UN e-Government Digital Index, the World Bank Index, and the OECD Digital Government Index. All these have shown sustained growth in the digital transformation and adoption of digital government across the public sector. And I'm going to focus my answer around the deployment of AI in the public sector, as AI has become a very hot topic over the last few years. To date, more than 60 countries around the world have launched national AI strategies, according to the OECD. Some of the key applications include in law enforcement, health, education, general administration, and social care. And these all help to bring forth a more sort of cost-effective public sector, and one that truly delivers for the citizens. When things go well, you often don't hear about how AI is working in the background. But when things go wrong, they can go really wrong. Some of the examples include the benefits scandal in the Netherlands, the GCSE fiasco in the UK not too long ago, and also how US is using it for law enforcement and also for sentencing. Some of these examples are really prominent, and we can imagine the scale of harm that is causing to the people being affected, which is why it's really important for governments to think about the responsible, accountable, and transparent use of AI when they are wanting to adopt it. In the first instance, high public trust is really important in terms of managing and governing the technology, and in guarding against cybersecurity attacks and breaches to data privacy. And to this end, to promote citizen trust in digital technologies, the city of Amsterdam and Helsinki have implemented publicly available algorithmic registers that have been designed with the citizens in mind. So basically, citizens can go onto the register website to find out what sort of algorithms are being used in their city, what is the purpose, what data sets are being drawn upon, how is data being processed, what are some of the non-discriminatory practices that are being considered in the design and deployment of the algorithms, what human oversight is there, and what is the risk level. So these are the things that will help to raise awareness around how algorithms is being used and how citizens' data is being used as well. Citizens can also, through the website, participate in some of the human-centered AI design activities. So again, it's not just to bring awareness, but really to draw in that citizen participation, which is now made available through these sort of platforms. And on the public sector facing side of things, the Singapore government has earlier this year launched what they call AI Verify. It's a governance testing and framework toolkit that provides a benchmark for companies to measure the safety of the AI products before they're being launched. This is to ensure that what you see in the market have gone through a certain level of testing and are being used responsibly. And the framework consists of 11 AI ethics principles that are in alignment with the OECD and the EU and so on. And maybe just to end off with a national level example, South Korea is the first country to introduce AI impact assessment on the national level. This happened in 2020. And this serves as a risk management tool to ensure that organizations have sufficiently considered systems, relative costs and benefits before implementation. Because we shouldn't just implement AI when we can, but only when we need to, and there is demonstrable benefits.
Thanks, PeiChin. It's great to hear how others are approaching accountability and transparency and putting some kind of ring fence around it. Siriwat, staying on the topic of accountability and transparency, how can governments and tech industry leaders in Asia collaborate to establish effective regulation and guidelines for the responsible use of emerging technologies, like PeiChin said, on AI, to ensure digital safety and ethics? Over to you, Siriwat.
Yes, thank you for the question. So just to set the tone for this question, I'd like to cover on 4 points. And so the first, which you already mentioned, is on transparency and accountability. The second point is on collaborative frameworks. Number 3 is on international cooperation, and number 4 is on ethics by design. And so onto the first point, regarding transparency and accountability, we see that regulations should prioritize transparency in AI development, but also in its deployment and decision-making process. Furthermore, establishing mechanisms for accountability, such as AI impact assessments, as our previous speaker had mentioned, is extremely important, as well as audits that can help to ensure ethical use. And the second point I'd like to cover is on collaborative frameworks. So with regard to collaborative frameworks, governments and tech industry leaders should establish collaborative frameworks where they can work together to develop regulations and guidelines. We see that it's quite important to go between both the public and private sectors in terms of sharing knowledge, experience, know-how, and more. These frameworks could also involve some regular dialogues, joint task forces, and public-private partnerships. And so we can see that in the region and around the world, this is a very common practice. We can say that it comes in phases or cycles where certain trending technological issues such as AI or blockchain in recent years has been a hot topic. And we see that countries in different capacities, or government or non-government and so on, choose to focus on them during these themed events. And it does bring about a kind of mutual understanding. And so onto point number 3, which is also quite relevant, is international cooperation. So Asia can seek opportunities for international cooperation on digital ethics and AI regulation based on their own experiences and different stages that they're at, to create harmonized standards and promote responsible use on a global scale. So on this part, it's a little trickier. Of course, in an ideal world, we would all like to agree with each other, have the same standards and the same opinions and ideologies. But of course, that's never the case in a global situation. So to be a little bit more realistic, it does come down to mutual respect and understanding that not every nation is exactly the same. We do need to fine tune and adjust it sometimes. And finally, onto the last point is ethics by design. So ethics is one of the key pillars of AI, mainly because AI is a cross-cutting technology where it affects all forms and points and stages of decision-making. And so with that, if we wish to use these technology-powered platforms to help our decision support systems, our decision-making, ethics does have to be designed and considered from the very beginning. And so really to encourage the integration of ethics into design and development of AI technologies from the outset and not as an afterthought. So I think that, again, ethics, I would like to emphasize, is quite important. We have to consider what are the implications, what does it entail in the future. Not everything about AI is just about increasing productivity and improving efficiency, but also what are some of the, let's say, effects or the negative impacts that it could result in. So for the first question, I would just like to keep my part there. Thank you.
Thank you, Siriwat, and thank you for highlighting the importance of collaboration, especially around the use of responsible AI, among many other things. Aakash, your view on this? In the G20 Summit Leaders Declaration, several recommendations have been shared to support technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. So in which way will they support digital inclusion and accessibility?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Kadra, for that question, and thank you, organizers, for calling us. It's the last session, I know, so people are tired. First of all, a very important inclusion was the inclusion of African Union. So that's a very important kind of digital inclusion strategy, which G20 as a whole agreed that we need to have Global South in the decision-making tables. So that component is the biggest kind of digital inclusion thing. And on, let's say, from the Indian standpoint and also larger G20 standpoint, there was some sort of agreement on, let's say, the framework of digital public infrastructure. So how do you develop, deploy, and make sure the governance principles are aligned, where you can specifically use digital public infrastructure to make sure people are included, the gender divide, the kind of income divide can be bridged using digital tools. The second component was India is leading this, what we call is One Future Alliance. And how can you provide specific advocacy efforts to provide specific digital tools and digital frameworks to, let's say, lower middle income countries? So that's a kind of a voluntary initiative which India has led. That's one of the important components to make sure the digital inclusion is far wide and it's majorly in the Global South. And the third point is, how do you do, I think we had a conversation on responsible AI. So there was some sort of agreement on there's G20 AI principles that you can have some sort of governance framework where there's standardization, there's international cooperation to have some sort of governance architecture for G20 AI principles where you can deploy AI. And specifically, how do you provide digital technical tools, not to, let's say, white collar service sector industries, but to agri-tech, to agriculture, to farmer communities, to, let's say, women-led initiatives. That's another component which was very important, which G20 as a group agreed to. And one of the other components was that, as I think in the opening remarks, that we do see women are not participating in the cyberspaces. So, and also young people, specifically for marginalized sections. So how do you provide some sort of cyber awareness, cyber kind of tools for them to deploy and participate in the larger kind of digital economy? So there is some sort of G20 toolkit, which is for that kind of component. So in that way, there are multiple things to include and make sure the digital economy is accessible to, let's say, larger, not just the global north, not just the, let's say, industrialized world, or let's say not even in the, let's say, global south, only industrial kind of sectors, but to ensure it is available for farmer producer organizations. So that's the larger kind of emphasis. And there's one important component which they also agreed on. It's some sort of digital health. We do see most of the times in the vaccine development, we saw that how vaccine research and everything was, led by the global north. So how do you ensure that the frameworks of, let's say, digital research and specifically on vaccine development is shared amongst all? So there is some sort of agreement on, let's say, you have G20's, WHO kind of framework on some sort of digital health frameworks under obviously data security guidelines. So these are 3-4 points where the G20's New Delhi Declaration helped to have, let's say, the larger kind of digital inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Aakash. And maybe I think this is a good segue to come back to maybe Siriwat. And in an increasingly interconnected world, what strategy can Asian nations implement to bolster cybersecurity and protect critical infrastructure that we talked about, while still promoting open and accessible digital space for their citizens?
Right, thank you for the question. So I think in all aspects of a digital world or economy or society, it does come down to being connected. And through this kind of digital interconnectivity, it does allow us to more conveniently integrate ourselves as users and consumers to all of our applications and platforms, to all our national level systems, and even more importantly, connected to the critical information infrastructure, right? And these are crucial components for the everyday operation of entire nations, of entire economies and societies. And so it does lead to many potential risks and vulnerabilities in terms of cybersecurity. Simply put, we can say that the more connected we are, the more, let's say, efficient our communication is, but at the same time, it does create more spots for vulnerability in terms of risks and threats and attacks and so on. And so just to cover a few points, I would like to discuss firstly national cybersecurity strategies. So as you rightly mentioned at the beginning of this panel discussion, all countries are trending towards, a digital nation, economy and society. We have to develop and basically start, our new structures in terms of how we approach cybersecurity at the national level. And in order to develop, comprehensive national cybersecurity strategies, they do have to outline clear objectives, have risk assessments, action plans for safeguarding critical infrastructure. Another point is on public-private partnership. I know I already mentioned this before, but again, it is extremely important where collaboration between governments, private sector, civil society, all collectively have to crucially address the, let's say, cybersecurity challenges, and also to facilitate information sharing, threat intelligence, and joint responses to cyber threats. So those few points that I mentioned at the end, they are actually, we could say, the easiest to do, the more straightforward, which is simply sharing. But as we know, for confidentiality reasons, for other, let's say, clash of interests and other sorts of reasons, sometimes this information isn't shared in order to remain private. And because it's not shared, it does hinder our efforts and approaches in terms of cybersecurity. So that's the nature of it, but it is, let's say, inevitable to a certain extent. Another point is on education and awareness. So to promote cybersecurity education and awareness, this is really to empower not only at the national level, but also individuals to be able to firstly recognize or identify and also respond to these cyber threats that we may face on a day-to-day basis. Again, another, let's say, simple and straightforward practice is of cyber hygiene, where, the basics of digital literacy and protecting yourself, authentication, passwords, basic software updates, the list goes on. But again, just highlighting what we could call the low-hanging fruit and how consumers as individuals can protect themselves, and in turn, this will protect their organizations. Another few points that I'd like to mention are on regulatory frameworks. So again, regulatory frameworks are important to protect our citizens and consumers, but at the same time, they should be, let's say, adjustable or adaptable, not to completely, let's say, strangulate the process of innovation and reduce creativity, but just to keep in mind that each nation is at a different stage. And so it does have to be a very, let's say, adaptable process over time. And finally, again, a repeated point on international collaboration, but in this time, we refer more on the cybersecurity side, is to engage, again, in these international and regional events to share best practices, intelligence, but more importantly, on the technical side, we can also create channels to coordinate responses to cyber threats, which have some sort of cross-border implication. Thank you.
So if I got that right, what I'm hearing from you, Siriwat, is that cybersecurity is everybody's business, and learning, adherence, and to be vigilant are some of the core. From cybersecurity to green recovery, and PeiChin, maybe a question for you in terms of how do we shape digital innovation ecosystem for green recovery, especially your experience with Singapore, for example.
Thank you. I think that's a really key question. I think our observations are that, you know, governments are currently not just, it's not just sufficient for governments to play the role, you know, of being a taxman and to regulate the tax sector, but rather to play the role of also facilitating, convening, and also being a user of some of these data and digital solutions. Governments can play a very anchor role in fostering healthy digital ecosystem, such as by building minimal public digital infrastructure for the public sector and private sector, and also by facilitating platforms for innovation, such as, you know, in Singapore, the government has initiated something called the Open Innovation Platform to enhance the sort of matchmaking between problem owners and problem solvers, and really encouraging and crowding in private sector expertise. On the topic of green and climate, we see that there has been a big gap in terms of discussions around green and climate and data. So these two discussions or communities seems to be quite sort of distinct and separate. And I think that this is where governments can play a real active role in bridging the gap and bringing these two communities closer together. On this front, we're currently scoping up a project from the Policy Hub in Singapore, but we're working with global players on that, and that is on greening ICT. Because despite its transformative potential, the use of AI is projected to consume significant amount of energy, and therefore resulting in high carbon footprint across the value chain, from the grid to data centers to the AI models themselves. I think globally, we need better ways of monitoring, measuring, standardizing, and incentivizing the sustainable use of such technologies. Therefore, we're embarking on this new project, and the role is really to equip government with the foundational knowledge and practical guidance to assist decision-making around the greening of ICT systems for AI and compute. A key part of this will be on developing innovative policy approaches and recommendations, such as the use of sandboxes. So the two other speakers mentioned about the importance of sort of multi-stakeholder groups and around setting standards and agreeing and complying to them. So I just want to do a quick call here. So we're looking to convene a multi-stakeholder group with a important emphasis on civil society. So if anyone's interested in greening ICT, please do get in touch.
Great, excellent. Thanks, PeiChin. And Aakash, I've been reading a lot about digital revolution in India. Maybe we can speak about that, and maybe if you can also share some of the strengths and limitations.
Thank you, Kadra. That's always an interesting question to talk about India. And, you know, I'm really happy the way PeiChin just said her remarks, because, you know, digital revolution is such an important component which India has done for the last 10 years. So let's say a small kind of facts for people. India has 99% of the Indian people have digital identities. 680 million people have their unique bank accounts, and 830 million people, let's say, access internet. So you have 1.2 billion people have their mobile phone connections. So you have such a big kind of digital kind of inclusion at that level, of a scale of 1 billion people on digital. And so it's a revolution itself. So how did that happen? The point is, so first and foremost was to do something called the digital identity, which we call Aadhaar, which is like you provide some sort of biometric to, let's say, all people in India. It happened in a matter of 6 to 9 years, where you were able to do that kind of scaling. It could not have happened had we not used digital. So remember, we already had identity cards, which took us 50, 70 years, still had leakages. So that was one of the important components. What it did, because you solved the problem of who you are, the kind of identity question you solved through digital means, it reduced the cost of acquisition. So as per World Bank studies, let's say know your customer kind of thing. How do I identify who you are? The cost reduced from, let's say, $25 to $1. So that just opened the floodgates for innovation. Because for now, tech companies, for technology, telecom companies, it's easier to, let's say, know who you are and provide services. And that opened up gates. So you have 1.2 billion mobile phone connections. That led to, let's say, opening of bank accounts within a matter of minutes. And today, I think in the opening remarks, we were talking about, let's say, gender divide. In India, we had in, let's say, 2011, 22% of the women had bank accounts. By 2017-18, we have 77%. So only through digital means, we could close that kind of gender gap. And we opened, let's say, 500, let's say, million bank accounts in the last 9 to 10 years. And as per some estimates, had we used traditional banking channels, it would have taken us 45 years. So that kind of quadrupling, leapfrogging happened only because you used digital means. The next kind of innovation, because you solved, let's say, mobile phone and the banking problem, that you can make easy payments. Let's say monthly right now, we do 10 billion payments, 10 billion transactions, which is, let's say, $200 billion, with, let's say, 260 to 300 million unique users. And these include, let's say, 1 cent payments. You can go to, let's say, in India, tea shop, and you can just buy a tea from using your digital means. So that kind of was a revolution which happened. Those major strengths are you do kind of widespread digital identity. Then you ensure the cost of acquisition goes down. Third is you ensure the cost of, let's say, transacting in the digital economy goes down. So that's the 3 component. We call it Jam Trinity. Jan Dhan is kind of bank accounts, Aadhaar is digital identity, and mobile phone is like your telecom connection. Obviously, there are also limitations because it was so internet-led. So we had to ensure that you make sure that internet reaches everywhere. But we did get some updates from, let's say, from 7% in 2007, the broadband internet connection, it has gone to 45%. But still, if you look at the gender level, the rural women are not able to access internet, let's say the urban women, like the income levels are totally driven. So local kind of rural spaces you don't. So we are facing that kind of difficulty. So how do you solve that? You ensure there is voice-based, chat-based payment. So now the next level of inclusion is you do some sort of text-based that you can go and just say this, I want to do this, and the transaction happens. Using Bluetooth technology, you don't need internet. So that kind of next level of phase we are doing. Local languages, mobile first, voice-based and chat-based payments. So that kind of a broader kind of view of India. You reduce your cost of acquisition, provide digital identity to everyone, and then startups, small companies can build over that digital public infrastructure. And that's the kind of our revolution. Thank you.
These are impressive numbers, Aakash. The pace of development in these areas you mentioned is truly remarkable. So now focusing on the people side, I think when we talk about technology, we should always talk about the people.
Yes.
So PeiChin, a lack of literacy and digital skills are consistently reported as key barriers to mobile internet adoption and used in the majority of APAC countries served by the GSMA. How can we create opportunities and implement best practices for more digital literacy and inclusivity? Over to you.
Thank you. And I think that is such an important question, because I think a lot of times we kind of focus around the technology and the infrastructure, and skills often sort of comes in the background or a little bit later. I think the good news is that worldwide, the percentage of world population that is now online has increased. And it has increased globally by 100 million in the last year. In the APAC region, there's a very high level of connectivity. 97% of APAC is now covered by broadband network. However, 41% of that, which is 1.7 billion people, they are not using the internet, despite living in areas that are covered by broadband network. And this is referred to by the GSMA as the mobile internet usage gap. And unsurprisingly, the people who are unconnected are people from less wealthy backgrounds, less educated, older, people living in rural areas, people with disabilities, and also women. As you mentioned in your question, Kadra, the lack of literacy and data skills are the top reasons, and these are followed by affordability as well as relevance. I was in Seoul at the GSMA Global Leaders Forum a few weeks ago, and this was exactly the roundtable discussion that we had. So some of the ways to address the barriers, I think the first thing really starting from the user need. We see different user needs in different countries. For example, in Ghana, people used the internet primarily for social connection and entertainment. And in India, it was primarily for work and income, education, home and lifestyle, alongside social connection and entertainment. So I think user needs are really a critical starting point, because in order to reach them, you have to engage them on use cases that matter to them. And on the sort of female demographic profile, some of the speakers around the round table, including those from small islands, reflected that women tend to be the sort of entrepreneurs in the family. So I think crafting a message that would respond to their need for providing for the family is something that will more likely to resonate with them. So I think in terms of the messaging, we need to also be very mindful about gendered language and focusing on the purpose, the motivation, and less so on the technology. Years ago, before I joined the Tony Blair Institute, I was working with the Mayor of London on the digital skills program. And I was really struck by one of the one of the statistics, that we came across in that program, which is that only 60% female participation in the tech sector in London. And this is very, very low. What is more staggering is that number hasn't changed in the last 10 years. So I think that and we looked into commissioning research around job descriptions, for example, and it turned out that a lot of the occupations in the tech world are heavily sort of using very masculine language that comes across as pretty off-putting for women. So I think, although that is sort of addressing a different value chain in the system, I think that it also applies when we're talking about different demographics in the population. We need to be very mindful about the messaging. And then thirdly, it's around having multi-channel approaches, finding appropriate channels such as using local radio, local community, faith groups, community leaders, prominent local business people who can act as ambassadors, and helping the underrepresented group feel like they can sort of relate better to the people that they see. Last but not least, it would be around adopting omni-channel approaches. As many countries move towards the digital-first approach, I think it's really critical to consider the citizen-first digital journey, which is to adopt not just multi-channel, but omni-channel approaches, meaning that we need to communicate the right information to the right person at the right time. And this goes beyond just using digital apps when we are looking at developing different types of touch points. For example, public agencies can look at adopting service centers and kiosks to complement some of the digital means that are available, and different platforms will need to be adopted to reach different audiences. And I think this is such a critical thing to address because in our research around digital labor platforms, we have seen how platforms, the likes of Gojek, Grab, Uber, being really key towards opening up flexible employment and entrepreneurship opportunities to a lot of people, especially women in the developing countries. And this could serve as a vital means for women who may face institutional barriers elsewhere.
I like what you said about understanding the user need and being mindful about messages and gendered languages. I think that's an important point there. I'm conscious of time. I'm just going to pick up one question from our wonderful audience, which I think is a really good question. And this is by Tuntun Nang. Apologies if I said it wrong. He or she, apologies. We provide our information to the business in the digital world. So what assurance can those businesses give us that our personal data will remain private and confidential? So I think we've got, happy for any of the panelists to pick up their hands, to pick it up. But I think that's a good question in terms of what assurance can those businesses give that the personal data will remain private and confidential?
I can pick it up. So let's say there are two approaches. One is, let's say, EU kind of model. You have a very good, solid regulatory standpoint that you have specific law-based regulation that you can't do it. And what we have done in India is totally little bit, let's say, you do have regulations, you do have, let's say, legal kind of approaches where you just mandate that if you violate, if you do some sort of, let's say, illegal kind of, let's say, taking of data of, let's say, users, you have some sort of, let's say, penalties or something. But the other component is that every time you access data, we call it in India as data empowerment and protection architecture. It's a kind of a technical tool that I have to give consent. Every time I'm, let's say, some tech companies are also doing it. Apple does it. Let's say whenever you are using a new app, they just say that, do you want to give that kind of trackers to other things? So there's two specific approaches. Either you do mandating legal things, and the second part is you do some sort of technical interventions, which are, let's say, easier to do and on a wider level. But be careful. It's easier for bigger organizations to do, let's say, a lot of regulatory kind of build up. It impacts the smaller startups, and let's say small businesses, because they might need data. So you have to have very clear filters. What kind of data I cannot use? Because otherwise what will happen? You will incentivize big companies to regulate this space and dominate this space. And let's say disproportionately impacting small businesses. So we have to be very careful in that way. Thank you.
Right, and I think there's another question that I'm just scrolling up to. And this is by Dr. Ahmed. And how can countries in Asia collaborate to establish harmonized sets of standards and policies to address ethical, I think we've addressed that, ensure privacy and promote digital while fostering innovation and inclusivity in the digital? What role do institutions like the Tony Blair Institute, Asian Vision Institute, and Digital India Foundation play in facilitating this regional harmony? Maybe we can go through the panels.
I'm happy to go first. I think this is such an important question. Again, I mean, we've talked a lot about the sort of regional harmonization, and that is one of the biggest challenges that we're having. I think that there has been a number of global efforts that prioritize government bodies, intergovernment and supranational sort of government bodies like OECD, Aakash mentioned the G20, there is UNESCO and all that. But there are major gaps in the representation, such as lacking a Asian and African representation in the OECD, for instance. The US withdrew from the UNESCO in 2018, and the Global Partnership on AI, GPI, has been seen as a challenge for China's goals for AI. So these are real challenges for all of us. I think that the fact that these bodies and coalitions are largely Western-centric is a prominent issue, and the Tony Blair Institute is playing a critical role in expanding the representation at GPI, for example. And we have recently helped Senegal to become the first African nation to join the alliance. And working with the heads of state in many other governments, including small states, to have their voice heard.
Okay, and then I think we can pick up another. Go ahead.
Maybe I can just build on that response, just to share a little bit of what we can do, not just our institution or organization, but what could be said about all of our similar types of entities. With this common, I think, vision and mission for really strengthening in terms of security and digital ethics and so on, in a practical way, it does come down first to people-to-people connectivity, right? So through our personal connections, for example, today's webinar is extremely important. It's just one of the many platforms I'm sure our speakers and our moderator here today were involved in. It starts with networking, people to people, and then we bring it back to our institute. Sometimes we start projects, sometimes we start research initiatives. We have these different type of agreements. So there isn't one specific way in which we can let's say expand our outreach or influence, but there are many. But again, it does have to start I believe from the ground up. Usually if it comes top down, it's more conceptual, and when something is more conceptual, it's a little bit harder to implement and so on. So I would say that in our field where we are all institutes trying to move forward and trying to make an impact. I think we just have to keep it simple, starting with, these kind of events and activities with projects, and, most importantly, not to lose focus on the end goal, which is to have influence to, I guess, to the bodies or the individuals that make the most impact. I think this is where we can start and how we can be practical and also effective.
Excellent. We're getting a lot of questions. One last question, and I think maybe Siriwat, you're the person to answer it from a cybersecurity perspective. What are the key challenges and strategies for protecting IoT device from cyber attacks in an increasing connected world? And this goes out to the panelists, but keep it 30 seconds, maybe 60.
I'll keep it short. I mean, when it comes to IoT, simply put, it's all about creating new devices within a system, and the more devices you have, statistically, there will just be a higher risk. So how to protect that? I mean, you don't need a device for everything, even though I'm a technology enthusiast. I'm a fan of AI and all of its applications and all types of technology. But I think we've reached a point around the world where sometimes we're creating new technologies just with a kind of shiny object syndrome. We forget about why we're creating them. Is it really useful? Does it truly have more benefits than it has risks? And when it comes to IoT, it's exactly the same. All these sensors and securities at home and cameras. I mean, it's great for certain things, but you also have to think about, okay, if you were to weigh out the pros and cons, on the technical side, how can you protect? I mean, let's be real, you can never protect anything 100%. No system is ever 100% secure. So I think the only thing you can truly control are the individuals that use it, the consumers, understand when to and when to not use certain devices, understand how you yourself can practice through, as I mentioned, multiple authentication, passwords, all the basic software updates. I think that's where almost 80 or 90% of the social engineering aspect comes into play. So we can minimize, but we can never completely get rid of it.
Excellent. I think in that, with that last statement, we will close. And our panel discussion on ensuring a safer and ethical digital world. This has been an enlightening journey. We have had the privilege of hearing from our esteemed panelists on how technology is undeniably a game changer. But with all great powers comes with greater responsibility to ensure that it serves the common good, respect our values and safeguards our security. We extend our heartfelt thanks to all of you for joining us on this essential journey towards ensuring a safer and more ethical digital world in Asia. And with this, we close this event. Thank you so much and good day.